The restaurant was loud, silverware clinking, glasses toasting, laughter filling every corner. But at table 15, the most dangerous man in the city sat in absolute silence. He didn't come here for dinner. He came here to meet someone who was supposed to be dead. But before the waiter even reached his table, something slid across the floor and touched his shoe. A crumpled napkin. He almost ignored it until he saw the handwriting. Small, shaky, written in a child's hand. Just one word, help. He looked up. Across the room, a little girl stood frozen beside her mother. Her lips trembling, her eyes begging, her tiny hand still half hidden behind her dress, as if she wasn't sure the message had reached the right person. Behind her, a man in a leather jacket tightened his grip on her shoulder. Too tight, possessive, dangerous. The waiter walked right past her, completely missing the fear carved into her eyes. But the Mafia boss didn't. His fingers slowly curled around the napkin, crushing it like a trigger he was seconds away from pulling. She had chosen him. Of all people in this room, she had chosen the one man capable of turning a quiet dinner into a war zone. And when he stood up, every bodyguard in the room froze because they had never seen that look in his eyes. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will shake the entire criminal underworld and reveal why this little girl risked everything to reach the monster at table 15. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. Alessandro Russo had been called many things in his 43 years: monster, king, devil. But tonight, sitting in Bellecourt Italian Bistro, he was just a man waiting for answers about a betrayal that had cost him everything 6 months ago. The restaurant buzzed with the usual Friday night crowd, couples celebrating anniversaries, families sharing pasta, business deals being struck over wine. None of them knew they were eating dinner 20 feet away from the head of the most feared crime family on the East Coast. Alessandro preferred it that way. Anonymity was power. The moment people recognized you, they either ran or started planning your funeral. He'd learned that lesson watching his father get gunned down outside a pizzeria when he was 12. His fingers drummed against the white tablecloth as he scanned the room. Dante should have been here 15 minutes ago. Dante, his former lieutenant, his childhood friend, the man who had supposedly died in a warehouse explosion that destroyed $3 million worth of merchandise and nearly triggered a war between the families. But Dante wasn't dead. Alessandro had proof, photos, bank records, witness statements from people too terrified to lie. Dante had staged his own death, stolen the money, and was now living under a new identity in Miami. Tonight was supposed to be their reunion. Alessandro had sent word through the old channels. A simple message. Table 15, Bellecourt's 9 o'clock. Come alone or don't come at all. The clock on the wall read 9:17. Alessandro's jaw tightened. Disrespect was a cancer in his world. You let one person get away with it, and suddenly everyone thought they could test you. He'd built his reputation on swift, brutal responses to even the smallest slights. But before he could signal his men to start looking for Dante, something caught his attention. A flash of movement near the hostess station. A family being seated 3 tables away. The woman was in her 30s, blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing a floral dress that had seen better days. She kept glancing toward the exit, her hands shaking as she reached for her water glass. The man beside her was older, maybe mid-40s, with graying temples and expensive clothes that didn't quite hide the hardness in his eyes. He spoke in low, controlled tones, his hand resting possessively on the woman's arm. And between them sat a little girl, maybe 8 years old, with dark hair and enormous brown eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. Something about the scene felt wrong. Alessandro had spent decades reading people, learning to spot lies, fear, and danger in the tilt of a head or the twitch of an eye. This wasn't a happy family dinner. The woman flinched when the man leaned over to whisper something in her ear. The little girl sat perfectly still, like she was afraid that moving might trigger something terrible. Alessandro's attention might have drifted back to watching for Dante, but then the little girl turned and looked directly at him. Most children would have looked away immediately, intimidated by his cold stare. This one held his gaze for 3 full seconds, and in those seconds, Alessandro saw something he recognized. Pure, desperate terror. The kind of fear that came from knowing you were trapped with no way out. The same fear he'd seen in his own reflection after his father's murder, when the rival families circled like vultures, waiting to carve up their territory. The little girl's eyes darted to her napkin, then back to Alessandro. She picked up her crayon, the one she'd been using to color the children's menu, and began writing something. Alessandro watched as she carefully tore off a corner of her napkin and crumpled it into a tiny ball. The man beside her was focused on his phone, scrolling through messages with the intensity of someone conducting business. The woman stared at her untouched plate of food, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. That's when the little girl made her move. She dropped the crumpled napkin and gave it a small kick under the table. Alessandro watched it roll across the restaurant floor, weaving between chair legs and server stations until it came to rest against his Italian leather shoe. He bent down slowly, his movements casual, like he was adjusting his pant leg. His fingers closed around the tiny ball of paper. When he unfolded it, his blood turned to ice. The word was written in purple crayon, the letters uneven and shaky, but unmistakably clear. Alessandro's eyes snapped back to the little girl. She was still watching him, her small face a mask of controlled panic. She gave the slightest nod, confirming what he already knew. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This child was in genuine danger. The man at their table suddenly looked up from his phone, his gaze sweeping the restaurant with the practiced awareness of someone accustomed to watching for threats. When his eyes passed over Alessandro, they lingered for just a moment too long. Recognition flickered there, not the kind that came from seeing someone on the news or in a photograph. This was the recognition of one predator identifying another. Alessandro folded the napkin and slipped it into his jacket pocket. His mind was already calculating angles, exits, witnesses, and the number of innocent people who might get caught in crossfire if this situation exploded into violence. But first, he needed to understand what he was dealing with. The man's phone buzzed. He answered it with a curt, his voice carrying just far enough for Alessandro to catch fragments. Something about a schedule, a departure time. The phrase package delivery spoken with the kind of emphasis that suggested it wasn't about shipping boxes. Alessandro's jaw clenched. In his world, packages often referred to people who were being moved against their will. The waiter approached their table, a young kid with nervous energy and a smile that suggested he was working for tips. The man ordered for all three of them without consulting the woman or child. "We're in a hurry," he told the waiter. "Make it quick." The woman's hands were trembling so badly she could barely hold her water glass. The little girl sat motionless, her coloring abandoned, her eyes now fixed on the table as if she was afraid to look up again. Alessandro's phone vibrated. A text from Marco, one of his lieutenants positioned near the front entrance. "Still no sign of Dante. You want us to start looking?" Alessandro typed back. "Hold position. Something else is happening." He needed more information before he acted. Moving too quickly could put the child in more danger. But waiting too long might mean losing his only chance to help her. The man at their table stood up abruptly. "I'm going to make a call," he announced, his hand briefly squeezing the woman's shoulder in what looked like affection, but felt like a warning. As he walked toward the restaurant's rear exit, Alessandro caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. The outline of a gun barely visible beneath the man's jacket. Alessandro had two choices. He could mind his own business, wait for Dante, and handle his own problems like he'd planned. Or he could intervene in a situation that had nothing to do with him, potentially exposing his location and putting his own operation at risk. But then he looked at the little girl again, saw the way she glanced hopefully toward the exit where the man had disappeared, as if calculating whether she could run. Alessandro Russo had done terrible things in his life. He'd ordered deaths, destroyed families, and built an empire on fear and violence. But he'd never hurt a child, and he'd never walked away from one who needed help. His hand moved to his phone, fingers hovering over Marco's number. The next few minutes would determine whether this quiet Friday night dinner turned into a rescue mission or a massacre. The decision crystallized in Alessandro's mind like ice forming on glass. He pressed Marco's number. "Change of plans," he whispered into the phone, his eyes never leaving the woman and child. "I need you to run a plate for me. Black sedan, 3 cars down from the main entrance. And Marco, do it quiet." "Boss, what about Dante?" "Can wait. We've got a bigger problem." Alessandro ended the call and studied the restaurant layout with tactical precision. 2 exits, 17 tables, roughly 40 civilians, and at least 3 of his own men positioned throughout the room. The man with the gun had been gone for 4 minutes now, too long for a simple phone call. The little girl's head snapped up suddenly, her eyes wide with fresh panic. She was staring toward the back of the restaurant where the man had disappeared. Alessandro followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. The man was returning, but he wasn't alone. Another figure walked beside him, shorter, stockier, with the kind of walk that suggested military training. This second man's jacket hung loose, deliberately concealing what Alessandro knew was certainly another weapon. The woman at the table saw them coming, and her face went ashen. She reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it so tightly the little girl winced. Alessandro's phone buzzed. Marco's response was faster than expected. Sedans registered to a shell company. Same company owns a warehouse in the industrial district. Boss, this doesn't smell right. Shell companies. Warehouses. Armed escorts. The pieces were forming a picture Alessandro had seen before, one that made his blood boil with a fury he rarely allowed himself to feel. Human trafficking. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a custody dispute or a family argument. This was something far worse. The woman and child weren't just in danger. They were merchandise. The 2 men reached the table, and Alessandro watched the choreography of control play out. The original man sat down while his partner remained standing, positioning himself where he could watch both the table and the room. Classic protection formation, but they weren't protecting the family. They were guarding their investment. The little girl's coloring crayon rolled off the table and clattered to the floor. When she bent to pick it up, she glanced once more toward Alessandro. This time, her message was different. Her lips moved silently, forming words only he could read. Please. Alessandro's hand moved to his jacket, fingers brushing the grip of his pistol. But starting a gunfight in a crowded restaurant would be suicide legally and tactically. Too many witnesses, too many innocent people, too much exposure. He needed a different approach. Standing slowly, Alessandro smoothed his suit jacket and walked toward the restroom area, passing close enough to the family's table to overhear fragments of conversation. Flight leaves at 11, the first man was saying. We need to be at the pickup point by 10:30. The package is getting restless, the second man replied, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone discussing cargo rather than human beings. Package. The same word he'd heard on the phone call. In the restroom, he dialed another number. This time, it wasn't one of his lieutenants. Detective Walsh, it's Alessandro. Yeah, I know what time it is. I need a favor. And before you say no, remember who kept your daughter out of that mess with the Colombians last year. Walsh's voice was weary but attentive. What do you need? I'm at Bellacourt's on 5th Street. Table near the back has a trafficking situation. Woman and a child. 2 armed escorts. They're talking about a flight at 11. Alessandro, I can't just take your word and raid a restaurant based on the kid passed me a note asking for help. Walsh, I've done a lot of terrible things in my life, but I don't lie about children in danger. A long pause. I'll send a unit for a wellness check, but if this is some kind of setup, it's not. And detective, tell them to come quiet. These guys are armed and jumpy. Alessandro ended the call and checked his watch. 9:34. If the police moved fast, they could intercept before any transfer occurred. But if they were too slow, or if the traffickers spooked and decided to cut their losses, he couldn't take that chance. Walking back through the restaurant, Alessandro made a decision that would either save 2 lives or end his own criminal career in spectacular fashion. He approached the family's table directly. Excuse me, he said, his voice carrying the polite authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm Alessandro Russo, and I believe your daughter dropped this. He held up the crumpled napkin. The effect was immediate and electric. The first man's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket. The second man shifted his weight, ready to draw. The woman's eyes went wide with a mixture of hope and terror, but it was the little girl's reaction that mattered most. She looked up at Alessandro with the kind of desperate gratitude that could break a hardened heart. I'm sorry, the first man said, his voice tight with barely controlled aggression. Do we know you? Alessandro smiled, the expression cold enough to freeze blood. No, but I know you, and more importantly, I know what you're doing. The restaurant suddenly felt quieter, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. At surrounding tables, other diners continued their conversations, oblivious to the fact that they were witnessing the opening moves of what could become a war. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," the second man said, his hand now openly resting on his concealed weapon. "The only misunderstanding," Alessandro replied, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout, "is you thinking you could conduct business in my city without my knowledge." The woman looked confused, not understanding the criminal terminology being exchanged above her head, but the little girl understood perfectly. She'd grown up in this world of coded threats and veiled violence. Her small hand crept across the table toward her mother's, seeking comfort in what might be their last moments together. That gesture, so innocent and terrifying, made Alessandro's decision for him. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text message to Marco. Now, within 30 seconds, 3 of Alessandro's men appeared at strategic locations throughout the restaurant. Not obvious enough to alarm the other diners, but visible enough to send a clear message to the traffickers. They were surrounded. "Here's what's going to happen," Alessandro said, settling into an empty chair at their table without invitation. "You're going to sit quietly, order dessert, and wait for some friends of mine to arrive. And if you do anything at all that puts this woman or child in danger, I will personally ensure that your last moments on Earth are more painful than you can possibly imagine." The first man's face flushed with anger and fear. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Alessandro leaned forward, his eyes becoming chips of black ice. "I'm Alessandro Russo. I own this city from the docks to the suburbs. I've killed men for looking at me wrong, and I've started wars over matters of principle. But most importantly, I've never ever let anyone hurt a child in my presence." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. In the distance, barely audible over the restaurant's ambient noise, came the sound of sirens approaching. The little girl heard them, too. For the first time since Alessandro had been watching, she smiled. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the restaurant's ambient chatter like a blade through silk. Alessandro watched the 2 traffickers exchange panicked glances, their carefully constructed facade cracking under pressure. The first man's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at the screen, his face going pale. "We need to leave now." "Nobody's leaving," Alessandro said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, especially not with them. The woman finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Who are you people? What's happening?" Alessandro turned to her, his expression softening just enough to seem human. "Ma'am, your nightmare is about to end. But I need you to trust me and stay very still." The little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, the nice man is helping us." "Nice man?" Alessandro almost smiled at that. He'd been called many things, but nice wasn't one of them. Yet somehow, this 8-year-old had seen past his reputation to something deeper. The second trafficker was growing agitated, his hand twitching toward his concealed weapon. "This is insane. We're walking out of here right now." "Try it," Alessandro said, his tone dropping to absolute zero. "See what happens." As if summoned by his words, Marco appeared beside their table, his massive frame blocking any potential escape route. Behind him, Alessandro could see his other men moving into position, casual, but deadly. The restaurant's front door chimed, and 2 plain detectives entered, their trained eyes immediately scanning the room. Detective Walsh was one of them, a thin man with gray hair and the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much. Alessandro caught Walsh's eye and gave the slightest nod toward their table. The detective's gaze shifted to the family, taking in the woman's terrified expression, the little girl's tear-stained cheeks, and the 2 men who looked like they were seconds away from bolting. "Evening, folks," Walsh said, approaching with his badge visible, but not threatening. "We received a call about a possible disturbance. Everything all right here?" The first trafficker forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Just a family dinner, officer. No problems here." "Is that so?" Walsh's partner, a younger detective with sharp eyes, focused on the woman. "Ma'am, are you here voluntarily?" The woman's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Years of conditioning, threats, and fear had taught her that speaking up only made things worse. But the little girl had no such conditioning. "They took us from our house," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her tears. "They said we were going on a trip, but we didn't want to go. The man said bad things would happen to Mommy if I didn't behave. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Walsh's hand moved instinctively to his service weapon while his partner stepped closer to the family. "Sweetheart," the second detective said gently, "can you tell me your name?" "Sophia Morales. This is my mommy, Carmen. We live on Maple Street. But these men came to our house 3 days ago." 3 days. Alessandro felt a cold rage building in his chest. These monsters had been terrorizing a mother and child for 3 days, and nobody had noticed they were missing. The first trafficker made his move then, lunging to his feet and reaching for his gun. But he'd forgotten about Marco, who moved with surprising speed for such a large man. The trafficker's wrist cracked audibly as Marco twisted it, sending the weapon clattering across the floor. The second man tried to run, but Alessandro was ready. He rose smoothly, intercepting the fleeing trafficker with a precise movement that sent him crashing into an empty table. The restaurant erupted into chaos. Diners screamed and dove for cover. Chairs overturned. Glasses shattered. But through it all, Alessandro kept his eyes on Sophia and Carmen, making sure they stayed safe. "Get them out of here," he told Walsh, who was already moving to shield the family. "Alessandro," the detective said quietly, "I need you to step back. Let us handle this." "They're handled," Alessandro replied, watching as Marco zip-tied both traffickers while they groaned on the floor. "But this is bigger than just these two idiots." He pulled out his phone and showed Walsh a series of text messages Marco had forwarded. "Bank transfers, warehouse addresses, shipping schedules. They're part of a network. Shell companies, offshore accounts, the whole operation. This family was supposed to be on a cargo ship by midnight, heading to God knows where." Walsh studied the information, his expression growing darker. "How did you get all this?" Alessandro's smile was razor-sharp. "I have my methods. But detective, if you want to shut down the entire pipeline, you need to move fast. They've got more people, more locations." The little girl, Sophia, had been watching this exchange with wide eyes. Now she approached Alessandro, tugging on his expensive suit jacket. "Mister," she said, "are you a good guy or a bad guy?" The question hit Alessandro like a physical blow. He'd spent his entire adult life being unquestionably the bad guy. He'd hurt people, destroyed lives, built an empire on fear and violence. But tonight, for the first time in decades, he'd used that power to protect the innocent. He knelt down to Sophia's eye level, his voice gentle in a way that would have shocked his enemies. "I'm complicated, sweetheart, but tonight I'm on your side." Sophia nodded solemnly, then surprised him by wrapping her small arms around his neck in a fierce hug. "Thank you for saving us." Alessandro felt something crack inside his chest. Some wall he'd built years ago crumbling under the weight of a child's gratitude. Carmen Morales finally found her voice. "I don't understand what happened. Who were those men? Why did they take us?" Walsh exchanged a glance with Alessandro before answering. "Ma'am, you and your daughter were victims of human trafficking. These men were planning to sell you." The words hung in the air like poison. Carmen's legs gave out, and she would have collapsed if Marco hadn't caught her arm. "But why us?" she whispered. "We're nobody special. We don't have money or connections." "Or that's exactly why," Alessandro said grimly. "People who won't be missed right away. Single mothers, children, immigrants, anyone society tends to overlook." He turned to Walsh. "Detective, they mentioned a warehouse in the industrial district. Shell company called Coastal Enterprises. If you move now, you might catch the rest of the operation." Walsh was already on his radio, calling for backup and search warrants. Within minutes, the restaurant was swarming with federal agents, local police, and crime scene investigators. Alessandro watched it all unfold with the satisfaction of a job well done. But he also knew his night was far from over. Dante still hadn't shown up, which meant either he was dead, in hiding, or planning something even more dangerous. Sophia appeared at his side again, having broken away from the paramedics who were checking her over. "Alessandro," she said, "will you make sure they don't come back for us?" The question revealed a wisdom beyond her years. She understood that removing 2 men didn't eliminate the threat. These organizations had tentacles everywhere, connections that ran deep into legitimate businesses and corrupt officials. Alessandro looked at this brave little girl who had risked everything on the hope that a stranger might help her and made a decision that would change the trajectory of his entire criminal career. "Sophia," he said, I promise you that no one will ever hurt you or your mother again. I give you my word." It was a promise that would cost him millions in protection expenses, require him to declare war on trafficking operations throughout the city, and force him to walk a line between his criminal empire and something resembling justice. But as he watched Sophia's face light up with relief and hope, Alessandro realized that some promises were worth any price. The little girl who had written help on a napkin had done more than save herself and her mother. She had reminded a monster that somewhere deep inside, he still had a soul worth saving. And that revelation would shake the criminal underworld to its very foundations. The warehouse raid that followed would become legend in law enforcement circles. Within 2 hours of Sophia's rescue, federal agents had surrounded the Coastal Enterprises facility like a steel trap closing. What they found inside defied their worst expectations. 43 people, men, women, children, all scheduled for transport within the next 6 hours. The operation was bigger than anyone had imagined, with connections stretching from the Canadian border down to Mexico and beyond. But Alessandro wasn't there to see the arrests. He had other business to attend to. At 11:47 p.m., his phone finally rang. Dante, the ghost who had started this entire evening. Alessandro came the familiar voice, though it carried an edge Alessandro had never heard before. "Heard you caused quite a scene at Bellacourt's tonight. Where are you, Dante?" "Close enough to know you just declared war on some very dangerous people. The Petrov organization doesn't forgive interference with their business operations." Alessandro felt icy form in his veins. The Petrovs, Russian Mafia, the most ruthless trafficking network on the East Coast. He just painted a target on his back that would never disappear. "You set me up," Alessandro said. The pieces finally clicking into place. The meeting, the restaurant, the timing. "You knew they'd be there." Dante laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "I needed you distracted while I handled some unfinished business. Your warehouse on Pier 47, $3 million in cash and product. Consider it payment for all those years of friendship." The line went dead. Alessandro stared at his phone, realizing he'd been played by a master. While he was rescuing Sophia and Carmen, Dante had been robbing him blind, but the betrayal ran deeper than money. Dante had known about the trafficking operation, had probably been feeding information to the Petrovs for months. Alessandro's own lieutenant had been complicit in the horror they'd witnessed tonight. Marco appeared beside him, his face grim. "Boss, Pier 47 is cleaned out. Professional job." They knew exactly where everything was hidden. How much? Everything. Cash reserves, product, the entire Eastern operation's liquid assets. Alessandro nodded slowly. In one night, he'd lost a fortune, gained deadly enemies, and discovered that his closest friend was a traitor. By any measure, it should have been a disaster. But when he looked back toward the restaurant where crime scene tape fluttered in the night breeze, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Sofia Morales was safe. Her mother was safe. 43 other victims had been rescued. The trafficking network would be crippled for years. Sometimes the right choice was also the most expensive one. Alessandro's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Walsh. "Federal Task Force wants to meet. They need someone with your connections to help dismantle the entire network. Interested in doing some good for once." Alessandro looked at the message for a long moment. Then he typed back, when and where. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight. Alessandro Russo was still the head of a criminal empire, still a dangerous man with blood on his hands. But Sophia's napkin had started something that couldn't be undone. Within a week, word spread through the underworld that Alessandro's organization was off limits to human traffickers. Anyone caught moving people through his territory would face consequences that made prison look like a vacation. The Petrovs tested him twice. Both times their operations simply vanished without a trace. No bodies were ever found, but the message was clear. Children were untouchable. 3 months later, Alessandro received a drawing in the mail. It showed a stick-figure man in a black suit standing next to a little girl and her mother. Above it in purple crayon, Sophia had written, "Thank you for keeping your promise." He framed it and hung it in his office. Right next to a photo of his father, 2 reminders of what mattered most. Legacy wasn't about the empire you built or the enemies you destroyed. It was about the moments when you chose to be better than what the world expected. Alessandro Russo had spent 43 years being the monster everyone feared. But one 8-year-old girl with a crayon had reminded him that monsters could choose to be protectors instead. The war with the Petrovs would rage for years. Dante would eventually surface only to disappear again under circumstances that remained classified. The federal task force would dismantle trafficking networks across 7 states using Alessandro's intelligence and connections. But none of that mattered as much as the simple truth Sophia had taught him that night. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is exactly who you want on your side when evil shows its face. And sometimes a crumpled napkin with one word written in crayon can change the entire course of a man's life. The monster at table 15 had become something else entirely. Something that would terrify the right people for all the right reasons. Because Alessandro Russo had learned that true power wasn't about being feared. It was about being the person a frightened child trusted to save her life. And that's the story of how one word written in purple crayon changed everything. Alessandro Russo walked into Bellacourt's that night expecting to confront a traitor and left having discovered something far more valuable than the millions Dante had stolen from him. Sophia Morales taught him that true power isn't measured in fear or territory or blood spilled. It's measured in the moments when you choose to protect instead of destroy. When you use your strength to shield the innocent instead of crush your enemies. The trafficking network crumbled. 43 lives were saved, and a monster learned he could choose to be a guardian instead. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is exactly who a frightened child needs on their side. Sometimes evil wears expensive suits and sits at corner tables. And sometimes a crumpled napkin becomes the first domino in a chain reaction that reshapes an entire criminal empire. Alessandro kept that napkin in his wallet for the rest of his life. A reminder that redemption can come from the most unexpected places. Written in the shakiest handwriting, delivered by the smallest hands. 3 months had passed since that night at Bellacourt's, and Alessandro Russo's world had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. The man who once ruled through fear now found himself checking security reports not for threats to his empire, but for updates on a little girl's safety. Sophia Morales had changed everything, and the ripple effects were still spreading through the criminal underworld like cracks in ice. The safe house sat on 15 acres outside the city, surrounded by walls that looked decorative but could stop a tank. Inside, Carmen Morales was teaching Sophia to paint watercolors at the kitchen table, their laughter echoing through rooms that had once housed federal witnesses and mob informants. But tonight, the laughter was forced, strained. Sophia had been having the nightmares again. Alessandro's phone buzzed as he reviewed security footage from his office downtown. Marco's voice was urgent when he answered. "Boss, we've got movement." 3 black SUVs, Russian plates, circling the perimeter of the safe house. The Petrovs are making their move. Alessandro's blood turned to ice. He'd known this day would come. For 3 months, he'd dismantled trafficking operations, cost the Petrov organization millions, and made it clear that children were off limits in his territory. But Vladimir Petrov was not a man who forgave. And he certainly wasn't one who forgot. "How long do we have?" Alessandro asked, already reaching for his gun. "They're not moving in yet. Just watching." "But boss, there's something else." Dante surfaced. "He's with them." The betrayal still cut deep, even after all this time. Dante, his childhood friend, the man he'd trusted with his life, had orchestrated everything. The distraction at Bellacourt's, the robbery at Pier 47, even Sophia's presence in that restaurant had been part of a larger plan to destroy Alessandro's empire. "Get everyone to the safe house now," Alessandro ordered. "Full protection detail. And Marco, call Detective Walsh. It's time to cash in some favors." Alessandro had spent weeks building an unlikely alliance with the federal task force. His criminal empire provided intelligence, their law enforcement connections provided legitimacy. It was a devil's bargain that left both sides uncomfortable, but it was working. 7 trafficking networks had been dismantled, over 200 victims rescued, and dozens of criminals put behind bars. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight was about protecting a little girl who had trusted him with her life. The drive to the safe house felt like the longest 30 minutes of Alessandro's existence. His convoy moved through the city streets with military precision, 6 armored vehicles carrying men who would die before they let harm come to Sophia Morales. These weren't just his soldiers anymore. They were protectors, guardians, Men who had found something worth fighting for beyond money and territory. When they arrived at the safe house, Alessandro found Detective Walsh already there, coordinating with federal agents who had turned the property into a fortress. Snipers on the roof, surveillance drones in the air, and enough firepower to start a small war. Walsh approached as Alessandro stepped out of his vehicle. "We've got eyes on the Petrov vehicles. 12 men, heavily armed. But there's something you need to know. They're not just here for revenge. They want Sofia." Alessandro's jaw clenched. "What do you mean?" "Intelligence suggests they're planning to take her. Use her as leverage against you. Force you to back down, return their territory, maybe even hand over your trafficking intelligence. A child as a bargaining chip." The rage that filled Alessandro in that moment was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It was pure, clean, and absolutely murderous. These animals thought they could threaten a little girl to get to him. They had made the gravest mistake of their criminal lives. Inside the safe house, Alessandro found Sofia curled up on the couch with her mother, both of them pale with fear. Carmen looked up when he entered, her eyes filled with the same terror he'd seen that night at the restaurant. "Alessandro," Carmen whispered, "Sofia's been having the dreams again. She thinks the bad men are coming back." Alessandro knelt down beside the couch, his voice gentle despite the fury burning in his chest. "Sofia, sweetheart, look at me. Do you remember what I promised you that night?" Sofia nodded, her small hand clutching the lighthouse pendant she still wore around her neck. "You said no one would ever hurt us again." "That's right. And I keep my promises. The bad men outside, they can't get to you here. I won't let them." But Sofia was 8 years old, and she understood more than most adults gave her credit for. She'd grown up in a world where promises were broken, where the people meant to protect children were often the ones who hurt them most. "What if they're stronger than you?" she asked quietly. "What if there are too many of them?" Alessandro reached into his jacket and pulled out the crumpled napkin, the one she'd sent sliding across the restaurant floor months ago. He'd had it laminated, preserved like the priceless artifact it had become. "Do you see this, Sofia? This little piece of paper changed everything. You chose to trust me that night, even though you didn't know me. You believed that someone would help if you just asked. And you were right." He took her small hands in his much larger ones. "Tonight, I'm asking you to trust me one more time. Can you do that?" Sofia studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "I trust you, Alessandro." The words hit him harder than any bullet ever had. Outside, the situation was escalating. The Petrov vehicles had moved closer, and thermal imaging showed armed men taking positions in the woods surrounding the property. Vladimir Petrov himself had arrived, stepping out of an armored limousine like a general surveying a battlefield. Walsh coordinated the response from a command center they'd set up in the safe house garage. Federal agents, local police, and Alessandro's men worked side by side, their normal animosity forgotten in the face of a common enemy. Alessandro's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. "Alessandro, old friend." Dante's voice carried across the line like poison. "Enjoying your new role as protector of the innocent." "What do you want, Dante?" "What I've always wanted. Your empire. Your territory. Your connections. But now I want something else too." "The little girl." Alessandro's grip tightened on the phone. "You touch one hair on her head, and I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." Dante laughed. "Such passion for a child you barely know. It's almost touching. But here's the thing, Alessandro. You cost me 3 months of planning when you interfered that night. Cost me millions when you started working with the feds. So now, I'm going to cost you something precious." The line went dead. Inside the safe house, Alessandro found Sofia and Carmen in the reinforced safe room he'd had installed. The walls were steel, the door was blast-resistant, and the ventilation system was independent. If everything went wrong, they could survive in there for days. But Alessandro wasn't planning to let it get that far. Sofia looked up when he entered, her young face serious beyond her years. "They're coming for us, aren't they?" Alessandro sat down beside her, his voice calm despite the chaos brewing outside. "Yes, they are. But Sofia, I need you to remember something important. Sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who protect the people we love." He stood up and walked to a hidden panel in the wall, revealing an arsenal that would have impressed a small army. Rifles, handguns, body armor, and enough ammunition to wage a war. As he began suiting up, Carmen gasped. Alessandro, you can't. There are too many of them. You'll be killed. Alessandro strapped on his bulletproof vest, his movements efficient and practiced. Carmen, 3 months ago, your daughter trusted me to save her from monsters. Tonight, I'm asking you to trust me to do it again. He knelt down one more time beside Sophia, who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes. Sophia, whatever happens tonight, I want you to remember something. You saved me just as much as I saved you. Before that night, I was just a man who took things from the world. Now, I'm a man who protects the things that matter. Sophia reached up and hugged him, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Be careful, Alessandro. I don't want to lose you too. The words nearly broke his heart. This little girl had already lost so much. Her father, her home, her sense of security. She'd been betrayed by the system meant to protect her, sold by men who saw her as cargo. And yet, somehow, she still had the courage to care about others. Alessandro pulled back and looked into her eyes. Sophia, no matter what happens tonight, you're going to be okay. Detective Walsh and his people will make sure of that. And Sophia, you're the bravest person I've ever met. Don't let anyone ever tell you different. Outside, the final preparations were complete. Federal agents had taken positions around the perimeter, while Alessandro's men prepared for what would likely be the bloodiest night of their criminal careers. But there was something different about them tonight. They weren't fighting for territory or money. They were fighting for a little girl who had reminded them that there were still things in this world worth protecting. Detective Walsh approached as Alessandro checked his weapons one final time. Alessandro, you don't have to do this. We can handle the Petrovs. Take Sophia and Carmen somewhere safe. Let us clean this up. Alessandro shook his head. This isn't about law enforcement anymore, detective. This is about promises. And I always keep my promises. The first shots rang out at exactly midnight, shattering the quiet of the suburban night. The Petrov assault team moved with military precision, advancing through the woods under cover of darkness. But they weren't prepared for the hell that Alessandro Russo unleashed upon them. He moved through the night like death itself, his years of violence and brutality finally put to a purpose that mattered. Every shot was precise, every movement calculated. These men had come to hurt a little girl, and Alessandro would make them pay for that mistake with their lives. Marco fought beside him, the two men covering each other as they systematically dismantled the assault team. Federal agents provided backup, their training evident as they coordinated the defense. But it was Alessandro who led the charge, his fury driving him forward like an unstoppable force. The battle raged for 2 hours, gunfire echoing across the property like thunder. When it was over, 12 of Petrov's men were dead or captured, their assault broken against the wall of protection that surrounded Sofia Morales. But Dante was still out there, and Vladimir Petrov had escaped. In the aftermath, as federal agents processed the scene and medical teams treated the wounded, Alessandro found himself sitting on the front steps of the safe house, his clothes stained with blood and gunpowder residue. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that went far beyond physical fatigue. Detective Walsh sat down beside him, offering a cup of coffee that Alessandro gratefully accepted. Hell of a night, the detective said quietly. Alessandro nodded, staring out at the chaos of the crime scene. Is it over? For tonight. But Petrov won't give up. Neither will Dante. They'll regroup, come back stronger. This was just the opening move. Alessandro took a sip of coffee, the bitter liquid helping to clear his head. Then we'll be ready for them. Sophia deserves to grow up safe, detective. Whatever it takes. When dawn broke over the safe house, Alessandro found Sophia and Carmen in the kitchen, making breakfast as if the previous night had been nothing more than a bad dream. Sophia looked up when he entered, her face breaking into a smile that made all the violence and bloodshed worthwhile. Alessandro, you kept your promise, she said simply. Alessandro sat down at the table, accepting a plate of eggs and toast with hands that still shook slightly from exhaustion. I'll always keep my promises to you, Sophia. Always. Over the following weeks, the war with the Petrov organization escalated. They attacked Alessandro's businesses, his shipping operations, even his legitimate investments. But every time they struck, Alessandro struck back twice as hard. The federal task force provided intelligence and legal cover, while Alessandro's organization provided the muscle and street knowledge necessary to dismantle a criminal empire. The breakthrough came when one of Petrov's captured men agreed to cooperate in exchange for witness protection. He provided the location of Dante's new base of operations, a warehouse complex on the outskirts of the city where the remainder of the trafficking network was still operating. Alessandro studied the intelligence reports with the focused intensity of a general planning a final battle. This was it, the chance to end the threat to Sofia once and for all. But it would require him to walk into what was essentially a trap, with Dante and Petrov both waiting for him. Detective Walsh tried to talk him out of it. Alessandro, this is suicide. They'll be expecting you. It's what they want. Alessandro looked up from the tactical maps spread across his desk. Detective, 3 months ago, a little girl trusted me to save her from monsters. I can't do that job halfway. The warehouse raid was planned for the following night. Federal agents would provide perimeter support, but Alessandro insisted on leading the assault team personally. It had to end with him. Dante was his responsibility, his failure. And Vladimir Petrov had threatened Sofia. That made it personal. Sofia seemed to sense that something was different when Alessandro visited the safe house that afternoon. She'd grown more perceptive over the months, better at reading the adults around her. When he sat down with her and Carmen in the living room, she immediately climbed into his lap. "You're going away again, aren't you?" she said quietly. Alessandro wrapped his arms around her, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and marveling at how such a small person could carry so much strength. "Just for a little while, Sofia. But when I come back, the bad men won't be able to hurt you anymore." Sofia pulled back to look at his face. "Promise me you'll come back. Promise me you won't leave us." The words cut deeper than any knife. This little girl had already been abandoned by so many people. Her father, the system, even the adults who were supposed to protect her. Alessandro knew that making promises he might not be able to keep was dangerous. But as he looked into Sofia's trusting eyes, he realized that some promises were worth the risk. "I promised, Sofia. I'll come back to you, no matter what." The warehouse complex was a maze of steel and concrete, perfect for an ambush. Alessandro led his team through the shadows, each man knowing that they might not survive the night. But they moved forward anyway, driven by loyalty to their boss and something deeper. A little girl's faith in the goodness of monsters. They found the trafficking victims first, dozens of them, men, women, and children chained in shipping containers like cargo. The sight filled Alessandro with a rage so pure it nearly overwhelmed him. This was what Dante had been protecting, what Vladimir Petrov considered profitable business. The exploitation of the innocent for money. Alessandro's team moved through the warehouse systematically, freeing victims and gathering evidence, while federal agents coordinated the larger operation outside. But Alessandro was hunting bigger prey. Somewhere in this maze, Dante and Petrov were waiting for him. He found them in the central office, a glass-walled room overlooking the warehouse floor. Dante sat behind a desk, relaxed and confident, while Vladimir Petrov stood by the window like a predator surveying his domain. "Alessandro," Dante said as he entered, his gun drawn but not yet aimed. "Right on time. I was beginning to think you'd lost your nerve." Alessandro kept his weapon trained on his former friend, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "It's over, Dante. The victims are free, the feds have your computers, and your organization is finished." Dante smiled, the expression cold and calculating. "But you're forgetting something, old friend. This was never about the trafficking network. This was always about you." The office door slammed shut behind Alessandro, and he realized too late that he'd walked into exactly the trap Detective Walsh had warned him about. But as armed men emerged from hidden positions around the warehouse, Alessandro found that he didn't care. He'd kept his word to Sofia. The victims were safe, the network was broken, and the federal agents would finish the job. The gunfight that followed was brief but brutal. Alessandro fought like a man possessed, his thoughts focused not on survival, but on a little girl's smile and a promise he'd made. When the smoke cleared, Vladimir Petrov lay dead, his empire crumbling around him. Dante was wounded but alive, his arrogance finally replaced by the fear he'd spent so long inflicting on others. Alessandro himself had taken 3 bullets, his body screaming in pain as federal agents swarmed the warehouse. But as he lay on the concrete floor, bleeding and barely conscious, He thought about Sofia Morales and the lighthouse pendant she wore around her neck. Lighthouses guided ships safely to shore, even in the worst storms. He'd kept his promise. The bad men couldn't hurt her anymore. Alessandro woke up in a hospital bed 3 days later, his body wrapped in bandages and connected to more machines than he could count. Detective Walsh was sitting in a chair beside the bed, reading a newspaper with a headline about the largest human trafficking bust in state history. "How long?" Alessandro asked, his voice barely a whisper. 3 days. You nearly died twice. The doctor said it was touch and go. Alessandro tried to sit up, pain shooting through his chest. Sofia. Carmen. Are they? They're fine. Safe. Sofia's been asking about you every day. Walsh set down his newspaper, his expression serious. Alessandro, there's something you need to know. With your testimony and the evidence we recovered, we can put Dante away for life. But the U.S. attorney wants to make a deal with you. Full immunity for your cooperation against other trafficking networks. Alessandro closed his eyes, the weight of everything that had happened settling on his shoulders. What's the catch? You'd have to give up your organization. Go legitimate. The days of Alessandro Russo, the crime boss, are over. When Alessandro opened his eyes again, Detective Walsh was surprised to see him smiling. You say that like it's a bad thing, Detective. 2 weeks later, Alessandro was released from the hospital. His first stop wasn't his mansion or his office or any of the businesses that had made him rich and powerful. His first stop was the safe house, where Sofia Morales was waiting for him. She ran to him the moment he walked through the door, careful of his still healing wounds, but desperate to reassure herself that he was really there. Alessandro, you came back. You kept your promise. Alessandro knelt down and pulled her into a careful hug, his heart full in a way that money and power had never achieved. I told you, Sofia. I always keep my promises to you. Over the following months, Alessandro dismantled his criminal empire piece by piece. Some of his men went legitimate, others found new families to serve. A few, the ones who couldn't let go of the old ways, found themselves answering to Detective Walsh and his task force. But Alessandro's transformation went deeper than just leaving crime behind. He established a foundation dedicated to helping trafficking victims, funded by the sale of his criminal assets. He opened safe houses, provided counseling services, and worked with law enforcement agencies across the country to identify and rescue vulnerable children. And at the center of it all was Sofia Morales, the little girl who had changed everything with a single word written in purple crayon. On the first anniversary of that night at Bellacourt's, Alessandro received a call from Carmen. Sofia wanted to see him, she said. There was something she needed to tell him. Alessandro found them at the community center where Carmen now worked as a counselor and Sofia attended after-school programs. Sofia looked older, more confident, the haunted look finally gone from her eyes. When she saw Alessandro, she ran to him with a drawing in her hand. It was a picture of a man in a black suit standing next to a little girl, but this time they weren't alone. Dozens of other children surrounded them, all of them smiling, all of them safe. Above the drawing, in Sofia's careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for keeping your promise to everyone." Alessandro looked at the drawing, then at Sofia, and realized that his transformation was complete. He was no longer Alessandro Russo, the crime boss. He was Alessandro Russo, the protector, the guardian, the man who had learned that true power came not from inspiring fear, but from inspiring hope. The monster at table 15 had become something entirely different. And it had all started with a little girl brave enough to ask for help, and a man broken enough to remember what it meant to be human. Sometimes redemption comes from the most unexpected places, delivered by the smallest hands, written in the shakiest purple crayon. And sometimes, when monsters choose to become protectors, the whole world becomes a little bit safer for the children who need heroes most.